just gonna go like how the book goes?
I mean, I'm guessing we've all read it, or we're all like familiar with it, so I don't think we need too much of a like an intro or anything like that.
Well, no,
But
for
maybe
sure.
for people watching the recording, because I guess a lot of people like to do that instead of actually attend. I would recommend you guys attend instead. But for those of you watching the recording, I'll briefly go over chapters 5 and 6, or books 5 and 6 of the Republic. Um, Funny enough, it was like scholars that ended up like dividing these books up. They were never originally meant to be like book one, book two, book three. It was all just like on big scrolls, and they more or less arbitrarily were like, ah, these kind of fit together. Let's turn these into a book. But anyways, I'll just read off some notes. Book five, or I guess books 1 and 4. It was all about discussing justice and how justice is good for the soul in the same way that health is good for the body. Um, there was like a lot of symbolism going on between Socrates, Adimantus, and Glaucon. Adimantus being the guy who like aligns himself a little bit more with the moderate, with the appetitive, with Glaucon a little bit aligning himself a little bit more with the courageous, always talking about like battles or swords or stuff like that. And then Socrates aligning himself a little bit more with wisdom, and that it's the interaction between these three interlocutors, that gives us the sense of what justice should be. It should be like this, the interaction between these three things. And then that gave them the idea to come up with this type of city where there is an interaction between those three roles: the appetitive, the courageous, the guardians, and then the wise philosopher kings. So a lot of like layering, I guess, that went on in books one to five. But then book five, like at the very beginning of it, he Socrates gets like halted a little bit by Adeimantus, I think, because Polemarchus whispers into his ear. He's like, "Should I ask him this? Should I?" So then Adeimantus asks him, "Hold on, Socrates. You mentioned briefly a couple things about like women being a part of this guardian class and like them living together and stuff. Like, what's going on with that? You're just gonna skip over this huge like practical and like societal building block that we need to go through if we want this perfect republic." And Socrates is like, "Hey, fine, I'll get into it." I don't know if he wanted to get into it because of how controversial it might have been, but he ends up getting into it. And this, in book five, is where he starts to talk about uh, how women should be treated or should be given the exact same roles as the men in the guardian class, granted they have the same physical and intellectual capacities. Because if they're going to be educated in the same way, it's reasonable to assume that they're going to be taking on the same types of tasks. And as we know, Socrates, or not Socrates, Plato, he doesn't really care about whether or not you have tits or like some nuts. He just cares about the soul, about the mind. And he's like, okay, cool. Well, women get the exact same answers in arithmetic and in geometry and logic that men do. There's nothing to say that they don't have this type of logos or this type of divine ability to interact with this world of forms, which we'll get into like book six. Then he talks a little bit about communal living. So I think that this was a little bit inspired by um, their defeat. So like this book's taking place after the Peloponnesian Wars, where they were defeated by the Spartans, and the Spartans, they almost like they lived in a very commune-like settings. Like their soldiers were almost like a copy and paste of each other in that they would eat the same food all the time, they would live in the same places, like they would spend all their same time together and get the same education, which was like a little bit different than the Athenian soldier. So I guess Plato was maybe taking a little bit from these guys, which in itself is extremely controversial because he's kind of like giving kudos to the Spartans, even though they were the ones that kind of defeated Athens at the time. So he talks about communal living as like a proto-communism where everyone eats the same thing, everyone learns the same thing, at least within the Guardian class. Then he talks about an even more radical point about the abolishment of private property and the abolishment of family. So he doesn't like the idea of there being a personal life within the home and then a public life, where you exit the home. You should be treating the people you immediately live with in your quarters as equally as the guy you see on the street. So like he wants to explode the family into the size of the society and not have that type of divide. He wants to like put those two things together, which Again, super controversial at the time. And keep in mind, yeah, this is like 2,500 years ago, so it's even more crazy to think of these things. Then he gets
Yeah.
onto okay. Sorry, did you want to say something?
Can I say something with the woman thing really quick?
Yep.
I also just want to say, like, I feel like that's almost like too generous a read because he's not really that egalitarian with it, at least like in my opinion. I think that like the reason for why he thinks that women like have the same capacity as men isn't necessarily because like they get the same answers in like arithmetic or whatever. It's because he's like they're both people and like they have those capacities, and he's like, but and there kind of is a big but, which is that there are still natural differences between men and women that should at least like play into somewhat how they're like most likely to choose. So it just kind of seems to be like almost like a benevolent, but still like misogynist view. Like I'll acknowledge that it's progressive for the time, but I don't think it's like as egalitarian as just like, well, they're also smart.
Yeah, no.
Right, and it's nothing like that at all. I agree with Lily here. It's more so just there's the physical aspect of something does not constitute its nature. It's just an attribute of its nature. And I think that's the kind of reading we should go with. Like the nature of the shipbuilder is going to be shipbuilding, whether or not they've got tits or not, right? It has a lot less to do with this progressive view from my read. It is more so just that when giving people jobs in this perfect city, we don't base it off their physical aspects, but in how and what forms they can connect to. Like the form of shipbuilding, if somebody can understand that form, then they're going to be a shipbuilder. It's more so the common Plato view that there's like this ignorance for the body, that it's nowhere near as good as the soul and as reason. So I think that's more so where it's coming. It's not about this how women and men can do the same amount of mathematics, the same amount of like literature and other philosophical pursuits and whatnot. It is more so this. Where is it? Here he says that we're less likely to pursue things when we or pursue trivial things when we divide things up into forms, right? And that's what he talks about the nature, because it's a ridiculous position not to introduce every form of difference and sameness in nature, but focused on the one form of sameness and difference that was relative or that was relevant to the particular ways of life themselves. For example, the male and the female doctor have souls of the same nature. And so it's a lot less having to do with the sexes, more so have to do with the nature of the soul.
Yeah, I'm on board with that. Maybe I misspoke a tiny bit, but I am totally on board with it. I do also think we should be a little bit careful in labeling Plato just because he's kind of saying some sort of like egalitarian views, labeling him as feminist as we understand feminism today, as well with using the words like commune and communism as they're understood today. It's just like we need to kind of put ourselves back 2,500 years and then understand it from how he's trying to explain how he's getting across. But like if we're going to like compare what he's saying to current day feminism, they're totally different things. As with current day communism and the way he's kind of explaining it. So yeah,
Right.
I did want to
Yeah, I'll say yeah, it definitely begins with discussion of the sexes. But let's go over where is it? Section 457 C and D is where it starts, where we're talking about only like no families, and if marriages exist, they should only be of beneficial nature. I think that's really interesting, that every child of the city is a child of everyone. There is no such thing as like we understand why it is for, because we don't want to have some people have prejudices over other people. We want people to look at all other citizens the same, look at all kids like it's their kids, and it makes sense at first, right? But then they get into this sort of eugenics kind of thing. We should only let the best breed with the best and the worst not breed at all. We want to make the next generation as best as possible, and I think that's really actually inconsistent with the rest of the Republic, considering that I think it's book 8, which we can get into next week, which he actually says that the perfect city won't last for more than a generation. Because over time it'll become this sort of oligarchy, democracy, then tyranny and whatnot. So having something as eugenics to ensure a greater next generation seems pretty contradictory of his later views in the Republic.
Yeah, I did also find it interesting, the concealment within. So like he wants to, like, he's coming up with these almost lies to set up the perfect society, right? He's like kind of like masking what it's actually going to be for the greater good, for everyone else. Which is pretty interesting because that doesn't seem very good. It just, like, at face value doesn't seem like it's something you should do. But if it's for the greater good, if it's for the state, understandable, because they're trying to set up this perfect state. But yeah, later on in that chapter, they talk about. I'm just gonna briefly run through the next bit for anyone like watching it. Uh, after that, then they get into a small discussion about, yeah, this eugenic stuff, pairing people together, splitting up the family with the state. Then they introduce the philosopher king, the guy at the very top, the golden class, and the idea that all the ideal rulers who understand justice and the common good, it should be these people, that should be the ruling class, and so on and so on. Then there's one big problem in the kind of like in the background that's been like breathing down your neck the entire time you read the book 5, and it's like, okay, cool, like you're suggesting all of these far out ideas, all in hopes of creating this like perfect society. But the biggest problem to me is like, how practical is this stuff? How realistic is it to attain this? This is extremely idealistic. And maybe in a way Plato's like setting himself up to respond to this question in book 6 with his theory of forms. Maybe not, maybe it was accidental. But it all seems like too good to be true. It's like people won't just easily drop what they're doing and be like, yeah, you know what? I don't need a family. Like, I'm totally okay with just like being the bronze class and like agreeing to not having kids, like, and all this stuff. It just like seems super idealistic, super controlling, super top down. Then book 6 comes in. Oh, sorry. Say whatever you want to say.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, something that my book does, like, I'm working off like the Penguin Classics translation of it, and so something that my books does, which I appreciate, is it does a good job of like giving blurbs of like explanation about like the ways in which like the translators divided up the books. I think there is some like contention on like how they should be, at least in my version. They're like the parts don't necessarily correlate to each of the chapters and like whatever, but it basically describes like when he starts book 6, it says that Socrates is again reminded of his promise to demonstrate the practicability of the state. He starts by distinguishing the ideal from the approximations to it, which are the best that can be achieved in practice, and maintaining that even if the ideal he has sketched cannot be realized in every detail, it still has been worth describing as a standard to aim at. He goes on to assert that the only hope of realizing it, even imperfectly, is for political power to be put in hands of the flawed. So like I think that that's like a fair characterization of like book 6 is where we start to get the bridge from ideal theory to more pragmatic theory.
You're thinking book 5, no?
Oh, sorry, yeah, book 5. Sorry, like halfway through book 5, or like at the end of book 5, right before he starts book 6, is when he starts to get into that conversation.
Yeah, a couple Stephanus pages before.
Like
Yeah, and
I'm at like 473. I don't know.
Yeah, so at 473, Socrates asks, I think it's Glaucon, if it was possible to do anything in practice the same as in theory, and then implies that it's the nature of practice to grasp truth less well than theory does, and I thought that was kind of interesting, considering that a couple lines later he goes, "Until philosophers rule as kings, who seem to be these sorts of what's it called? These masters of theory, right? Start ruling, then we're not going to have a good city," because it seems entirely opposite of that, right? Like, since these guys only know these philosophers know how to grasp truth in theory, it seems very contradictory to allow them to rule in practice, right? Like, it would seem more fair for them to advise rather than to rule themselves, because they're only able to grasp this, or they're attempting to grasp an ideal when obviously practice seems to be on a lesser nature, right?
Saw this as being parallel to like the way that Plato understands forms, which is that, you know, each thing, as Aristotle would say, takes part in the good, engages in the good, does the good, but it's not itself, but it's not the good in and of itself. The same way that you could do the same thing with ideals, where it's like you get closer to the form of this thing, you get closer to beauty itself, but you can never materially actualize that form.
Right. Let's not skip to book 6, though, right?
It's 5 and 6. I thought I'm allowed.
Yeah, but let's go ahead and finish book 5.
Yeah. So
Um,
let's talk about let's stay in book 5 and then do book 6. Book 6, I feel like that's everything Plato. That's like Plato 101. His whole forms, his whole theory, that's where it comes out. But I guess let's do whatever you want. I'm not a fucking boss.
I think a really fun thing to talk about in book 5 is the lover of sights and sounds versus the lover of beauty. Because the lover of sights and sounds, there are these people who love perceptible things, beautiful things, right? But the lover of beauty loves beauty itself, and that includes this sort of form of beauty. So we're finally getting a little what's it called? A little notion to the forms, almost for the first time in the Republic. And it's he compares it to wine lovers, to honor lovers, to sex lovers, and that's kind of what the philosopher is, for wisdom specifically, right? He doesn't just want wisdom in one little class of things. He wants all of wisdom, and he doesn't care if he's wrong. And so he's the philosopher because he's willing to try all kinds of learning and gladly turns to learning. Then that's a characteristic of why they should be a king, right? Because they're willing to be they're willing to know more and be proven wrong rather than be this like dictator like king.
I mean, we learn from like what book 3 and 4 that they can't want to be king, though.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But this is why they're
they have to be forced. Yeah. But that's also it's also like it is in the characteristic of that person to not want power.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because they have this sort of humility to them.
Well, it's not, I just think it's not what they're interested in, right? Like, I mean, like the way he describes the philosopher is like I mean, Philosia, right? Like it's love of knowledge, or Sophia, whatever. That's my middle name. Fun fact. Which is great for me, but I don't know. Like, I feel like it's just as like the idea that it is just not what they're concerned with. Right, like the person who loves knowledge, the philosopher loves all of knowledge, wants to know all of truth,
right.
Is not concerned with power, is not concerned with the
right. No, absolutely.
Is actually not even really concerned with the material, right? Like the person who loves knowledge is at their core concerned with forms, with like what things are in and of themselves, which is like
truth, yeah,
right, which is like the knowledge that they love, and so I don't know. I feel like it's almost like there are like natural inclinations of the soul, and like it's almost like you can only love one thing, I guess. Like it's kind of like monolithic.
But how do you convince someone who does not want to lead to lead?
You don't convince them. It's compelled. I mean, he describes it. He's like, they won't want to lead. We will force them.
Yeah, it's really and you also have to remember he says we'll probably never, if ever, be able to put this city in practice. This is just an ideal city, and so I forget if it's in the end of 5 or at 6 where he's like, we'll at the very least attempt to make as little changes to the ideal city to put it in practice. Hopefully we only need to make one change, if not 1, 2, if not 2, 3, and so forth, so on.
Yeah, but then how do you claim that the philosophers have the power and lead when you force them? Those who force have the power. Those who force are in the power up top, and you cannot have uh, have someone who is below you to force you to be above them.
Well, assuming they're philosophers, they'll get to the same conclusion as Socrates here, right? So they'll see that, okay, I will have to. They'll basically force themselves. They're looking for wisdom, but they're not they see that they're the only ones fit to lead. So it's not necessarily that they're forced by others. They're forced by how the ideal city is right.
The crux
How the structure is.
the crux of why they would want to be in power is not for the power or for the greed itself. It's for the good of the populace, right? So they see the
Right.
good of everyone as like that's what should be what should be got. So indirectly, the only way for me to enforce that or for like, to bring that into an actual thing is to get into power. And then once I'm into power, it will be for the best of everyone. It's in the best of everyone's interest for me to be best of everyone's interest to be like in that position. And I also think that like yeah, like the kids being raised in the society, they wouldn't want to be in power because it's not in the nature of like a little philosopher baby to want to be in power. But there would almost be like a council of older guys being like, "Nah, sorry, dude. Like this is your place in this world. Whether you want to or not, we know that you don't. But you have to be this king because what you want is the betterment of everyone." And then they're gonna teach this kid that the betterment of everyone means like for them to be in that position of power. I think that's how they would kind of like sidestep this like issue of practicality. But again,
Yeah, and also we have a little talk of it too as well in book 6 at the beginning of book 6 where it's just kind of like the qualities of the to be philosopher are wanted by a lot of people, right? And so we got to make sure that these kids who have these qualities aren't taken up by people who are sophists or great generals and soldiers, right? We want to make sure they stay on the path to philosophy. But before we get into that, I want to take a note to the forms at 476 where he says that each of them is itself one, but because they manifest themselves everywhere in associations with actions, bodies, and one another, each of them appears to be many. And I just really like this quick little explanation of how forms appear within the physical world. How it's basically it should be clear only specifically to philosophers that when you're grasping like a form of justice, for example, there is only one definition of justice. Justice is only one thing, but we see it everywhere, right? We see it in everything that is to be called just, right? It shares in this idea of justice. It makes its associations with bodies and actions and things that are physical, whereas the form itself is only one, is only this non-physical thing, right?
Ori, would you like to explain then the forums to the people watching the recording? He talks like we go over things like forums and opinions and all this stuff. Explain it to someone
Yeah,
who
no,
might
absolutely.
completely be familiar with what the heck a form is.
Yeah, but before we get into that, there's a triple distinction that you've got to understand about knowledge, opinion, and ignorance within Plato. Now, everything that is to be called knowledge is about what Plato calls is. Anything that is about knowledge, or anything that knowledge. The object of knowledge is what is. That's how I'm gonna say it.
It's
The
also
object of ignorance
what
is
is
what is not. Hold on. the object of ignorance is what is not, right? And then the in between there is opinion. And the forms are what is. They are never changing. And so Plato's theory of the forms just kind of goes like this. To put it very, very, very crudely, I have 3 books right here. They're all 3 different books, but we call them all books, right? So they each share in the form of books. Everything that is a book shares in the form of book because and it is this the book is only one thing. There's only one form of book but it manifests in everywhere that we predicate or call a book, right? So to Plato, this the Republic is about justice. So to find out what justice is, we shouldn't be looking towards anywhere that we see justice manifest. We should be looking to find out what the form of justice is. And that's why we can't necessarily call where the manifestations are knowledge, because the manifestations exist in the realm of opinion, right? In this idea that they're in between both what is and what is not when we perceive them. So he says it only remains for us to find what participates in both being and not being, and cannot correctly be called purely one or the other, if there is such a thing. So we call this the opinable, and thereby setting the extremes over the extremes and the intermediate over the intermediate. Which is basically to say that our perceptibles are intermediates between what is and what is not. And when we want to figure out definitions of something or what something truly is, we shouldn't look to participants. We should look to the form of something. Lily, if I missed anything, you want to...
Yeah, I think you were on the phone, but I asked him to go over or explain the forms to people watching the recording that might not totally understand or like be familiar with the forms. So if you missed anything on this whole idea of form versus opinion before it.
I think it's, I mean, the other interesting thing to add is just that he says that opinions are the intermediate position between knowledge and ignorance, which I really liked, because that supports my worldview. And if you just give people knowledge and the right opinions, and they should, or if you give people access to all of the knowledge and remove ignorance, then they should have knowledge. They should achieve knowledge proper, which
That's
I enjoy.
Begging the question, though, when you put it like that.
Well, but not really, right? Like, he describes it as being, I'll read it. He says,
at least when you put it like that, you're saying if we give people knowledge, they should have knowledge.
Well, but it's like if you give people, and like we're saying what is, like when I say what is, it's like I'm operating in like ancient philosophy, so it's like I think of what is as being like monism, right? Like I'm thinking of like Aaliyah, and so I don't know, like this concept is like different. Like I say what is because it's like I'm trying to refer to something that is both material and not material, I guess. It's like there's one way of saying what is, which is just like literally what is in the world, but also what is being like this allusion to forms. But he says that what is it? 477 like B, right? He says, isn't there something we call opinion? Of course. Is it the same faculty as knowledge or different? And it's different. So opinion and knowledge must have different correlates or corresponding to their difference of faculty. They must. The knowledge is related to what is and knows what is as it is. But there's a distinction I think I should make before I go on, which is that there's another class together. It's like faculties, which is what they give us the power to do, whatever. And then later, wait, where did it go? Oh yeah, sorry. 478D. He goes, in that case, I asked, do you think it is darker than knowledge but clearer than ignorance? Very much so. Does it lie between the two? Yes. Opinion is in fact intermediate between them. And then he goes on to talk about how, like, if you give someone knowledge of what is instead of ignorance of what is not, and I'm saying of because I'm saying of knowledge, then it seems like you can help that person achieve knowledge, right? And it also seems like he's putting knowledge on like a spectrum, but it's a spectrum that's like related to form. So it's like you achieve the form of knowledge when you have eradicated all of the ignorance, but you cannot say that you know until you've done that.
It to me seems that I think a little bit more interesting is how ignorance actually seems to be almost non-existent until he attributes the word ignorance to it, because it seems very what's the word for it? It's contradictory when he says that what is not is completely unknowable, and then he says ignorance, or he refers to ignorance as something that is what is not.
Yeah, but it's
But
like,
how can he know what ignorance is if what is not is completely unknowable? So it seems like it's really, really, really difficult to actually pin down true ignorance in the same way that the philosopher has a really hard time pinning down what is and it is itself, right? Or the form itself.
the way that I guess kind of understood it, and like the way that I would lay it out practically is like if someone, someone can know like that 2 + 2 = 4, right? But they can still be ignorant of like derivative calculus. And so it's like, yeah, you can have knowledge of like math, right? Or you can have like a particular instance of like knowing something in math, but I guess that's not knowledge of math, or that's not like knowledge of that thing.
Well, there's still specific forms, and like if we go back a little bit in the Platonic corpus to the Phaedo, the form of I think it was like water and mud or something like that makes the form of clay, right? So you can have mixed forms, and you can know a little like a smaller lower order form like the number 2 mixed with mixed with the form of exponent, for example, will give you the form of 4, right? Something like that.
If you don't like, but the question is just like when I'm talking about it as almost being like on a spectrum where it's like, yeah, that's an opinion then, right? Like if you don't know, if part of it is unknown, then that's an opinion. There might be a round in here. I might be getting kicked out.
I think a good separation between what is a form and what is an opinion is what is empirical. What can be attained by any type of faculty is 100% something opinion based. If things are being reached towards with your reason,
But he says we have a faculty for knowledge, though. Like he describes knowledge as being a faculty.
it's a separate faculty as the faculty.
I didn't have that translation.
Yeah.
Really? Wait, can I find it? Because he says that
Knowledge isn't a faculty the way. Oh, nice. Good going, man. It's great for the recording.
Hey, Chris.
Eh.
Yeah, so I think we definitely have to be wary of mistranslations, or off translations, right? Do you know who yours was translated by, Lily?
mine was translated by. It's the Penguin Classic. I didn't check the actual person. I probably should have, right?
Please don't be jealous.
No, it was Desmond Lee.
Oh, you have the older
It's an older translation. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's the same one who did the translation of the Penguin Classic for the Timaeus and the
Yeah.
other
Timaeus.
one. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I know who you're talking about, but it's I'm not into that translation.
What word do you have if not faculty?
I have power.
Interesting. You've capacity. Interesting. Do you have faculty? Do you have faculty earlier?
I have faculty nowhere in the Republic.
Oh, interesting.
I would assume that it translates to
477C. Wait, 477C, you don't have let us class together as faculties, the powers in us. You have that as capacities.
I have that powers are a class of things that are that enable us to do whatever we are capable of doing.
I have let us class together as faculties the power in us and in other things that enable us to perform the various functions of which we are capable.
So you have enabling and faculty. I have power and capability.
Yes. But do you have capabilities and does it say capable twice?
No, it says powers are a class of things that enable us to do whatever we are capable of doing. And he's not talking about mathematical powers here. He's talking about power to do X, right?
But then he says that later on he says that opinion should be classified as a faculty.
No, so he says for me, what about opinion? Is it a power or some other kind of thing? It's a power as well, for it enables us to opine. So the power of opinion is to opine, the power of knowledge is to know, and the power of ignorance is to ignore, I guess, right?
Matters too much on the translation though. Like whether it's power, capacity, or ability, it's just like anything. Like I have the ability to drop this pencil, but it's not the same type of ability or capacity as for me to understand that 2 + 2 is 4. Like reason should be set aside, whatever translation you want, whatever type of like capacity, reason, ability. It's just like we have this ability to like get up there into the forms, and that's what lets us grasp that concepts of number, geometry, and so on.
Right, no, absolutely. So we'll go ahead and leave that conversation alone. We can talk about that some other time. But go a little bit later to 478E. It says that opinion participates both in being and non-being. That is a heavy statement. Because those are participating in two opposite extremes. So I think that it's really a good argument to show that anything that is perceptible participates in opposites, and when it participates in opposites, it cannot be a form, so we cannot have forms in the perceptible world. That'll lead us into 6 here in a second.
I have a question. Okay, how do you defend learning is not recollection if you agree that forms aren't possible in the material world?
What?
How
do you defend learning is not recollection?
Because there's weak learning and like learning. There's like learning a fact like your birthday, or like when is your birthday? It's like, okay, I know I've learned that it is August 5th or whatever. But then it's like, what is 2 + 2? That is 4. It's a form of recollection with this. But it's like lowercase learning, happening learning.
I know that Ori disagrees, but I like Chris's read.
Learning is definitely not recollection when we get to the divided line here at the end of book 6. It's quite clear. But let's get on with book 6, and then by the end of book 6, I'll answer that question for you.
Cool.
Because
I'll run for the recording. So the forms were kind of more or less introduced here. Plato being too idealistic, what's going on here? So then he kind of restates or makes has the position that it's these golden class philosopher kings that care about the eternal forms. Everyone else, maybe not some guardians, but everyone else, like in the bronze class, they are just concerned with opinions and appearances. So they are concerned with the type of birth, with the type of book that they're given versus the bookness of the book, right? It's the philosophers that care about this like form stuff. It's not the average person that cares about this form stuff. That's established. And he also kind of brings up more issues.
Doesn't the philosopher have to care about everything though? Like, isn't it
Everything
like
about
the
what
part
is. They don't have to care
about
about
what?
opinion.
But like, it's you don't have to care. Like, yeah, I agree. You don't care about opinions, but I'm just saying, like, the philosopher cares about the book and the bookness of the book,
The form.
Well,
the knowledge that is within the book and the book itself.
the
It's
knowledge
interested
within the
in
book
the
is
form
something
of each
completely
thing.
different than the book itself. Especially considering now I hate bringing up other dialogues again, but the Phaedrus really is anti-writing, and that comes directly after the Republic, or is usually thought to come directly after the Republic. Where it's like you can't ever actually have a conversation with a book. If you ask a book a question, it's just going to give you the same thing over and over again. And so to do true philosophy, to do true dialectic, and diaresis, it would be strictly in conversation. But yeah, to continue the conversation of what book 6 is really, I mean, at the beginning, it's more so a question of, are philosophers just useless and pretentious like people? Like, do we need them? Why would we make them rulers, right? But right before that, Socrates, and a little bit after, gives some really interesting requirements for a philosopher, which is creative, ambitious, intelligent, strong-willed, curious, open-minded, has to have a good memory, and well-balanced. Because like think about it, if you were a slow learner, that's painful. No one does anything painful purposefully, and the philosopher wouldn't want to be in pain. And there's this like analogy with checkers. Talking to a philosopher is like playing against a checker master. You don't know why you're losing, but you're just like, oh, I guess I'm losing, and then don't take anything from it, right? And I think that actually is really interesting in like modern times, right? Like the stereotypes of the philosopher hasn't gone away today. Philosophy is just kind of what the people want it to be, right? It's not what truth is shooting for, right? Have we I want to ask y'all, have we started choosing philosophers today based on salesmanship rather than like how good they can do philosophy?
Depends how you define philosophy, but probably yeah.
And I think it also is a good comparison when Plato compares it to the captain. The guy who charts navigation and whatnot looks silly if you don't know what he's doing. He's just gazing up into the sky and like looking at stuff and like stuff like that, right? And it looks really silly if you don't know what he's doing and what it's good for. And so Plato compares the philosopher to that exactly. He says that um, the people who would be good philosophers are not allowed to become them because no one is knowledgeable of what it actually is, right? And then there's like the little problem of philosophy hinted at here, that it's really dangerous. The people with the qualities of a good philosopher may use those qualities for evil if it's not guided by truth. And that also frees up philosophy jobs for the people who don't have these sorts of qualities, right?
The argument could be made that if that's even the case, they're possessing of one quality, which is anti-philosopher, which makes them not a philosopher.
Yeah, no,
Yeah, like
absolutely.
I think the whole point is like it's almost like a purity argument where it's like if someone shows interest in something that isn't knowledge itself or isn't things in and of themselves, and that like disqualifies them from being of this class of people, right? Like that shows that they are not in fact who we're referring to when we talk about philosophers.
No, absolutely. And I think this kind of has a little window looking back at Thrasymachus from book 1. There's this sort of blind ignorance, right? That Thrasymachus just doesn't actually know what justice is good for. Nobody does bad willingly. Harm comes from ignorance, right? On this Socratic or Platonic view. So, like, I always like smokers as an example, right? Smokers actually do know that it hurts them, but don't know what. Like they always take this kind of chance, right? They say, I actually don't know that it's gonna hurt me. I know that it
They say
hurts.
actually, if you
Right.
quit by the time you're 30, it's fine.
Yeah, no, exactly. They say, well, 3 of my grandparents died from it, but one's still alive. So, and I look the most like that grandparent. So you don't actually know that it's gonna hurt them. They're a little bit ignorant to it, right?
The thing that interests me though in this discussion too, because it's like it's almost like Plato is setting up an argument that is like the philosopher cannot know like badness almost, right? Like there is, you know, especially well, Aristotle says evil's a privation, which is wonderful in this instance because like evil is just like that, like is like nothing, is nothingness, and so it's interesting in this context because it's almost saying that like you know the philosopher can't know badness because like that's just not what the philosopher is like concerned with. But at the same time, then I guess like it's almost paradoxical insofar as like the philosopher has to know everything, so they have to obviously be able to like know and like understand what the potential um like downfalls of the perfect society is, but they have to almost do it without understanding that people act badly because they aren't the type of person that would act badly.
I actually
Right?
want to push back on that point right there, because I actually don't think that it's more so in the way that you put it. Because for Plato, you know, the good is like the sun, right? It eclipses everything, right? And so nothing
It's
is. Hold
well
on.
that would be similar for Aristotle though. It's like it's a fountainhead
No,
theory.
I'm not saying that it's different for Aristotle. I think maybe Aristotle got this notion from Plato. But it's what makes the good thing good that makes the philosophers so good is kind of like light, right? If you don't know what something is good for, then really what is it? And that's kind of why Thrasymachus's view of justice is so skewed about what justice is good for, because he doesn't know the good itself. So bad doesn't necessarily imply this sort of something can't be bad in itself, I guess is what I'm trying to say, right? Everything is always good in itself. Some things aren't as good as other things, but making incorrect associations is what is bad, right? So bad is always in relation to something else, where good is always good in itself in some sort of way. And so I think that's maybe where Aristotle gets his notion of a privation, right?
No, it's like Aristotle literally believes that the absence of things is evil. Like it's beyond. It's like evil is a privation. Like but he distinguishes though, right? So there are things that are like you know can be taken from us and things that can't. So for example, if someone is born without the ability to see, you would not say that they were deprived of their sight, right? They just were not born with that capacity. And so he also thinks this similarly for like souls and like the different makeup of like different souls. They're different components that lend themselves to different things. And those things can't necessarily be like whatever the absence of those things so say like you know Aristotle also believes like people are good, guys the good. So like if people are good, then when people act badly they're depriving themselves of goodness, right? They're not acting like badly, they're just acting not good, right? And that's how like that's literally how he defines it. It's like evil is a nothingness, evil is a privation.
Okay, so this leads us into actually the exact next thing in the Republic. Philosophy has very dangerous ideas that can be easily misused, right? They can for example, a philosopher can weaponize scripture. So should philosophy be gatekept, right?
Isn't that the censorship discussion in book 1, right? Isn't it just like
Well, he
yeah,
keeps
like
going
right,
the entire book.
myths can be appropriated badly. They can
Right.
show the gods acting badly, and like stupid people will be like, "Oh, I want to be like the gods."
Well, no, absolutely. But now, what about philosophy itself? That was a talk about censoring poetry and censoring art, right? So, what about censoring philosophy, right? Or keeping people away from philosophy because of how much it can be misused? I think that's a really important talk to, and maybe that's the entire reason of the class division, right? Why we only let the best people, the people with the gold souls, become philosophers, right? Because of how easily it can be misused.
We're getting back at like a previous point that we hashed over on like the you don't have to gatekeep philosophy, but what maybe is dangerous at times is like the ability to argue efficiently, the ability for like good sophism. That's what's a problem. It's not philosophy itself. It's not philosophy proper.
Right.
It's like things that you often associate with philosophy, like being clever or witty or quick, or coming up with a persuasive argument. Like those things are very, very related to philosophy. Like they overlap nicely, but it's not philosophy proper. So I don't think there's an issue with gatekeeping philosophy as a thing. It's just we need to be very, very careful when we like engage with it and make sure that we're like not hinting towards okay, like argument is philosophy or like this is philosophy because it's like yeah.
It's also like Plato's terms are just like so absolute, where it's like, yeah, if anything falls short of literal love of all knowledge, that's just simply not philosophy. That is sophistry. And I think that or like like that is someone who again like has not shown the traits that are worthy of like deeming them a philosopher. Like anything that falls short of these ideals is not that thing. And I just think that's very interesting because it's also just like when he emphasizes that, or at least like in my translation, when it gives this preface where it's like, oh well, Socrates is returning to his point on like the practicability of like his ideals. I don't know, like it's very interesting because I still like wonder. It's like how is the philosopher then supposed to like is the philosopher the only person that's able to be taught that people act badly because that's the only person that can be trusted to know that that is the case.
So I wouldn't be able to answer that question for you, but I at least like off the top of my head, but I think it kind of has to do with this idea that the majority of people believe, and this is in Plato 505b, right? The majority of people believe that pleasure is the good, while the more sophisticated belief, not on the sophist side, right, but more so on the more developed side, believe that it is knowledge. And those who believe this can't tell us what sort of knowledge it is, but they end up forced to say that it's knowledge of the good. And I think it has to do a little bit, at least, with that kind of conjecture.
Yeah, I mean, like it also reminds me like that part in particular, 505, really reminded me of like the Euthyphro, right? Like it's like Callicles at Socrates. It's hedonism versus self-governance, like knowing oneself.
That's not the Euthyphro, that's the Gorgias.
Oh, the Gorgias. Sorry. I'm sorry. I misspoke. Maybe.
I was about to say, but it definitely does tie into the Euthyphro too, but we don't have to get into that. But I think that at the end of 505, we have this really interesting passage, and I'll go ahead and read it out. Every soul pursues the good and does its utmost for its sake. It defines that the good is something, but it is perplexed and cannot adequately grasp what it is, or acquire the sort of stable beliefs it has about other things. And so it misses the benefit, if any, that even those other things may give. So because we're too focused on what something's good for, we miss the benefit of what the thing actually is in itself. We're too focused on attempting to find the best way to do something that we end up missing 95% of the rest of the thing.
So then it's like, is the philosopher concerned with practical knowledge then? Like, is the philosopher concerned with imperfect manifestations of form? That's my question for you, Ori.
I wouldn't say that he's at the very least not concerned with them, but I would say that he's shooting to find out in how all fine things share in the form of fine.
That's the interesting thing to me though is when it's like philosophers are interested in things of themselves. Like I'm understanding that as like absolute forms, but then it also seems as though like for this practical conception of society, the philosopher has to be concerned with the imperfect manifestations of forms, has to be concerned with like people kind of doing badly, or has to be like understand that people are like capable of that. And so it's like is knowledge also, I guess it's not, but then it's like, how does what they know help them practically?
Well, I would say that it definitely helps them practically, considering a few lines later, right, we're talked that an opinion without knowledge is shameful and ugly, right? But an opinion
Isn't it just pure ignorance, though? An opinion without knowledge because it falls this way instead of this way?
I don't know if it's pure ignorance.
But then I don't know what an
But-
opinion without knowledge is because he says like opinions lie in between knowledge and ignorance. So then how can you have an opinion without, one of the co-constituents?
Because those things that you opine about still share in a specific form,
Yeah, I think
whether you know it or not.
whenever the word knowledge is used, you can replace it almost every single time with form. So like whenever there's knowledge of something, there is an aspect of form, or there is form in that thing. Any other time he'll use like opinion or belief, usually.
But that kind of is what I'm asking though. So like it's of that thing, but it's like everything that is encompassed in that thing, or everything that I'm gonna use Aristotelian
Well-
terms. You can shoot me, but like everything that takes part
Okay.
in that thing, everything that participates.
No, because then it's a
Is
manifestation.
everything that participates.
No, because
Okay.
Aristotle also has immanent forms. In the Republic, there are not immanent forms yet.
Okay, this is true. Aristotle does have immanent forms. That's a good point.
And also, no, I can still make an opinion about this pencil, just a really shitty opinion that has nothing to do with the form of the pencil, right? Or any form that that the pencil participates in. And
But it's almost like predicated on that lesser form of knowledge that Chris was talking about, which is like you're like, this is a pencil that we use for writing, right? Like that is something that's like taught. You wouldn't recall back to pencil unless you would.
take the idea of recollection out.
You wouldn't know the pencil through the form of pencil. You would know the pencil through its
Well,
like.
no, I can
practical
still have an
application.
opinion about it. I can say this pencil.
Yeah, right. But that's what I'm
I
saying.
use
Though,
this
is like,
pencil for
it's
hammering.
opinion-
That's my opinion, but it's not a good opinion for penciling because the pencil isn't a hammer. So
Right,
it's an
and that's what I'm
opinion
saying, though,
without
is, like-
knowledge. But I don't necessarily
But
classify
you
it
have,
as
you have
ignorant.
knowledge. You have knowledge that it's a pencil, though. So it's still there's knowledge of something, but it's like
I have
missing.
it's
the
an
ignorance comes
it's a pencil, but I didn't know that it's an instance of pencil. If I knew that it was an instance of pencil, it would be different, right?
I
But
think
then it would be the form of pencil.
I'd like to make the point that if you think that you know it's a pencil because you were told it's a pencil, you don't know that it is a pencil. Knowing that it is
As
a
well.
pencil is some sort of like
Yes.
whatever. But if it's just like
Yes.
reciting what you were told in that form of knowing, then no, not really. You don't know capital K the pencil.
Let's in that case then let's get into this idea of the visible versus non-visible, right? All these beautiful things are visible things, while the form of beautiful is intelligible, right? And he doesn't use invisible. He uses intelligible, right? And intelligible means that it has to do with the psychology, right? With the mind, with the soul. And it's hold on, sorry. So where is it? Sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
Well, with the intelligibility, the psychology, the grasping of the mind, putting you back on your train of thought.
Yeah, so basically when we can understand the soul in the same way, right? When it focuses on something illuminated by truth and what is, it understands, knows, and apparently possesses understanding. But when it focuses on what is mixed with obscurity, on what comes to be and passes away, it opines and is dimmed, changes its opinions this way and that, and seems bereft of understanding. So it seems like perception really is not respected as allowing any type of understanding. And what gives truth to the things is the power to know and know of the good within that thing. Because light, he's used this as light and sight analogy, right? Where the light is we can see the light, but it would be wrong to consider the light the sun, right? We can consider sunlight as coming from the sun, right? But we can't consider sunlight to be the sun itself. So we can see sunlight, but we can't see the sun itself because then we'll go blind, right? And so I think it's really interesting to go from that onwards. We can go into the divided line. And the first two parts of the divided line, which would be imagination and belief, is the realm of opinion completely, right? Where for imagination, we're looking through for an explanation, right? Through mythology, for example. How do earthquakes happen? So we imagine that, okay, it might just be Poseidon slamming his trident, right? And that's what causes earthquakes. And you start kind of using a little bit of clues. We know that mythology might be a little bit, so let's start looking for clues in the material world, right? But we take from Heraclitus here that the physical world is constantly changing, so it's really hard to look from anything in the physical world.
That's why we go to forms, right? Like that was the Heraclitean school stuff.
Right,
That was like
and this
Plato's
is why
influenced, yeah.
I'm gonna get into recollection doesn't need to happen. And so once we move on to the realm of knowledge, right, which would be thought and understanding, we take things such as mathematics. Let's use geometry specifically, right? Geometry can be used both abstractly and physically. We experience circles, but it's never an actual perfect circle, right? The perfect circle or the perfect square is probably never existent in the physical world, right? We're
That's
always
that's
building
the
upward.
example my book uses.
Yeah. It is.
In the explanations, though.
Right. We're building up towards pure concepts. And we're never actually at pure concepts with even though this is still in the realm of knowledge. We already have knowledge when we're building up towards pure concepts in thought. And this is why we don't need actually the theory of recollection. Because after we've built up using both pure concepts that are abstract and physical, we finally get to understanding of the pure concept in itself, right? For pure beauty, we can't get to this at all. It's almost impossible, if not impossible, to think about pure beauty without attaching it to a thing. But if I really want to know what beauty is, I can't rely on examples. So let's do a thought experiment real quick. Try to think of beauty itself without attaching it to a thing. Think of what is beautiful. You can't, right? Everything that comes to your mind is something that you think at least is beautiful. You're not thinking of beauty itself, right?
I'd like to interject a tiny bit just for like a second. I think there's a little bit of conflating going on with pure knowledge and reason. I think some like there's been a couple times in like your little argument where you've said you don't need to have pure knowledge to gain knowledge, right? But really, I think the more appropriate statement would have been you don't need to have, it's not knowledge, it's you need to have reason to access any type of knowledge. Not exactly knowledge to gain knowledge.
I'd have to disagree with you here because this is coming straight from the text. Within, you have your divided line, and it's divided into two unequal sections, and you divide it in the middle, right? Which is the visible and the intelligible. And on the second half of the line, you would have thought, right? And thought is part of the intelligible, but he uses both, like geometry, for example, that is both pure and physical concepts. So it's not strictly pure concepts there.
But there's an issue, I think, right there of like we need to be really specific with our words, because when we say there's geometry in the real world, that's an inappropriate thing to say. I think what's more appropriate to say is that there are geometrical manifestations in the world, not exactly that there's geometry in the world, right? There's geometry in our minds and in our ability to access these things. But for me to say that this is a circle or something, it's like, no, it's just a manifestation, an instantiation of a circle. It's a manifestation or instantiation of a geometrical form, not the geometrical form itself. So
I almost kind of disagree because like at least the example that I had in my text was that the circle that is drawn is not a perfect circle, right? You can have a concept of what a perfect circle is, but when you draw it, it won't like manifest that form reality. But it seems that there are some things, such as the concept of a perfect circle, which like can manifest in reality. Like maybe that's not something that would be
covered under forms per se, because like the knowledge of it is like more material. But I guess you could have like the form would be of perfect, right? Or the form would be of like equal itself, right? The form would not be of like circle itself, because it doesn't really mean anything. I don't know.
I'd like to disagree, because I do think that we can have and use geometry itself in the in our material world.
Geometry itself, sure. I
It's
fully agree
everywhere
with that.
in the
Yeah,
world,
that-
right? Obviously,
No,
the
right,
perfect
and I
circle-
agree.
The perfect circle we can't. It's a pure concept, sure, but
But the definition
geometry
of
is
circle
used
is
so
something
to
that's
understand that.
necessarily manifestable.
Sorry.
The concept of a perfect circle is something that's necessarily manifestable, like capable of being manifested.
Exactly, right. So you don't necessarily need recollection for it.
Right. So, but what I'm saying is like you wouldn't need a form for it. You need a form for perfect, because that's something you can't imagine. Right. Like I feel like
Well, the
we're
form of
going back into
circle-
this difference between material and like ideal. And it seems like forms exist in the realm of like the ideal theory, right? And so anything that is covered by a form is not something that can be manifested. So when you say something like a perfect circle, that can be manifested. You can have a circle that is like geometrically perfect.
You can't have
But
a
it's not.
But the form of circle, you just went back on yours. If you think that, then you can't think that Plato here in the Republic holds a theory of recollection to be true, because let me finish this. I see your interjection.
You just want to push this point because you just want to push this point.
I have to, because
I just want
the
to.
perfect
You guys
circle-
continue this little conversation or argument, but I need to rock and roll because I'm helping my parents move out, so I gotta go haul some cube, move some stuff with my dad. But it's been super fun. I do want to hear on the. If you guys could do like a summary, like premise point by premise point, to see where this argument for why there cannot be recollection, make
You
that.
should make ChatGPT watch the videos
Yeah, I should.
or something.
Okay, well, super
Have
fun.
you guys the outline?
You guys have fun, I guess. Go have at it. I'll catch you guys next week, or I don't know if I have time, like during the week. Peace out.
Peace.
Thanks very much. Bye, guys.